a black executive, returning home after a long business trip, settled into his first-class seat as the plane cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet. The atmosphere was calm until a flight attendant's sharp voice broke through. She accused him of stealing a first-class fork, her tone laced with suspicion, and her eyes narrowed as if she'd already reached her verdict. Passengers turned to watch as the man, humiliated but composed, calmly denied the accusation. But when the flight attendant began searching his seat without permission, something shifted. Just as tensions reached their peak, a voice from across the aisle interrupted an elderly passenger pointed beneath the man's seat. The missing fork lay there, untouched. What happened next stunned the entire cabin. The flight attendant was called to the front by the captain, and just minutes later, she returned with her head lowered and lips tight. The captain personally apologized to the passenger, and by the time the plane landed, whispers of the incident had spread throughout the airport. This is more than just a story about a fork. It's about prejudice, dignity, and standing tall in the face of quiet injustice. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. If this resonates with you, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the norm and inspire change. The hum of engines filled the cabin of Flight 216 as it soared over the Atlantic, cocooning its passengers in a lull of soft light and luxury. In first class, the world seemed far removed from the one below. Glasses clinked softly as champagne was poured, and the glow of entertainment screens flickered against polished wooden panels. Everything was carefully curated to exude privilege, exclusivity, a place where the world's troubles did not follow. Seated near the window, Marcus Bell adjusted the cuff of his charcoal blazer, his reflection faintly visible in the glass as the sun dipped beneath the clouds. His seat was more of a throne, the kind that reclined fully into a bed, but Marcus hardly noticed the extravagance. His laptop glowed softly, casting light onto his face as he sifted through reports and correspondence. Marcus was not unfamiliar with this space. First class was where he often found himself. As the CEO of Beltec Systems, international travel had become a necessity rather than a luxury. He preferred the quiet up here, the absence of elbow jostling, the distance from the indignities he sometimes encountered elsewhere. Yet, despite his tailored suit and polished demeanor, Marcus knew he was still an anomaly to some. Across the aisle, an older gentleman, dressed in the unmistakable uniform of wealth-pressed slacks, leather loafers, spared Marcus a glance. It wasn't hostile, nor was it particularly warm. It was the kind of glance that lingered just a second too long. As if taking mental inventory, Marcus felt the gaze but chose not to meet it. He had grown adept at ignoring the language of subtle suspicion. The first sign of trouble arrived not with loud accusation, but with something quieter and absence. Amelia White, the lead flight attendant, moved fluidly down the aisle, collecting trays with the precision of someone who had done this for decades. She was efficient, polite, but her smile did not reach her eyes. Marcus noticed her the same way he noticed most things, quietly, from the corner of his vision, without drawing attention to the fact that he was observing her. When she reached his seat, Marcus glanced up briefly and offered his tray. The remnants of a 3-course meal sat neatly stacked, the plate pristine. He nodded politely, but Amelia's eyes drifted downward, scanning the tray with an intensity that felt out of place. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone light but firm. "Where's your fork?" Marcus frowned slightly, his mind still tethered to the last email he had read. "It should be on the tray," he replied, glancing down. "It's not," Amelia said, her voice tightening, as if she had already drawn her conclusion. Marcus blinked. "I'm sure it was there when I finished." "Well," she continued, her smile thinning, "it's not here now." The conversation, though civil, carried weight, a subtle shift in the air. Like the first crack in glass. Marcus could feel it, he always felt it. The unspoken tension that so often found him in places like this. "I imagine it may have been taken when the plates were cleared," Marcus offered, keeping his voice even. Amelia's eyes lingered on his face, searching for something. She didn't nod, nor did she accept the explanation. Instead, she remained by his seat a moment too long, her tray held at her side like an anchor. "We don't misplace first-class silverware," she said finally. Marcus straightened in his seat. He recognized this dance, the careful phrasing, the poised politeness masking something colder beneath. Are you suggesting I took it? He asked, tilting his head. The question hung in the space between them, heavy with implications. Amelia did not respond immediately. I just need to check your seating area, she said, moving a step closer. No, Marcus replied, his tone sharpening. You do not. A flicker of discomfort crossed Amelia's face, but she concealed it quickly beneath the veneer of authority. She did not step back. It's just procedure, she insisted. Marcus's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. He could feel eyes around the cabin now watching, listening. It's a fork, Marcus said plainly. If you're that concerned, call the captain. Amelia hesitated. The challenge was not what she expected. Passengers in first class rarely resisted. They complied because they knew it was easier that way. But Marcus Bell had spent a lifetime swallowing this kind of indignity. And today, he found himself unwilling. Amelia's eyes flicked toward the intercom near the galley. Marcus did not look away. Call the captain, he repeated. At 30.000 feet, the cabin grew colder, not because of the altitude, but because of the quiet tension that had settled over it. An unwelcome passenger neither of them could shake. The cabin seemed to shrink, the hum of the engines fading into the background as Marcus Bell met Amelia White's gaze. There was no shouting, no overt hostility, just the cold mechanics of an accusation thinly veiled as protocol. Marcus had encountered this before, though rarely in such a public, compressed space. It was always subtle, polite to the point of condescension, wrapped in the silky language of suspicion. Yet, beneath Amelia's smile was something raw. Something Marcus recognized from boardrooms and boutiques, from hotel lobbies and late-night traffic stops. The fork wasn't the point. Amelia lingered, waiting for Marcus to yield, for him to shrink as so many before him had. But Marcus didn't. He adjusted his cuff and remained still, his silence louder than anything he could say. Passengers around him shifted in their seats, sensing the standoff but unsure whether to intervene. After all, this wasn't their fight. Sir, Amelia began again, her voice tightening like a wire stretched thin. It would only take a moment to check. I'm sure you understand. Marcus exhaled slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone who had spent years navigating rooms that felt like minefields. I understand, he replied, his tone calm but edged with iron. That my seat is not a place to be searched unless you have reason beyond a missing piece of silverware. There was a shift, minor, but perceptible, in Amelia's posture. Her eyes flickered to the nearest passenger, as if hoping for an ally. The older man in the next row looked away, pretending to study the wine list. Marcus could see the calculation behind her eyes. She knew this was more than just about the fork, but she had made a choice the moment she hovered by his seat. Now, pride kept her rooted there. Amelia's hand moved toward the intercom, but before she could call the captain, another voice cut through the cabin. Excuse me. A woman's voice, soft but firm, the kind that commanded attention without raising volume. Marcus turned slightly, as did Amelia. A woman 2 rows back, wearing a light gray sweater and reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, looked directly at Amelia. I saw his fork fall, the woman said plainly. She gestured beneath Marcus's seat. It slipped when he adjusted his laptop. For a brief moment, Amelia froze. The power dynamic of the situation teetered precariously. The weight shifting. Marcus said nothing, waiting to see how Amelia would respond now that the accusation had lost its teeth. Amelia knelt, slowly retrieving the fork from the floor. It gleamed under the cabin lights, as innocent as the moment it had fallen. Marcus watched her rise, their eyes meeting once again. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the tension that had thickened the air between them. Thank you, Amelia said to the woman, ignoring Marcus entirely as she turned toward the galley. Marcus leaned back in his seat, feeling the stares pressing into him from all angles. The woman in the gray sweater offered him a polite, knowing smile before returning to her book. The incident was over, at least on the surface. But Marcus knew better. These moments never truly ended, they lingered, etched into memory like scars. As Amelia disappeared into the galley, Marcus let out a quiet breath. The plane continued its course, cutting through the sky with mechanical indifference. But Marcus felt the weight of something far older than this flight. Something that stretched across time and history, an accusation without words, a trial without evidence, and a quiet resistance that never seemed to end. The fork was gone. It had returned to the galley, clinking quietly against the other utensils as if nothing had happened. But Marcus Bell knew better. He remained still, hands resting lightly on the armrests. Yet there was no mistaking the tension now lodged deep in his chest. It was not about silverware. It rarely ever was. As the flight pressed on, Marcus could feel the echo of the incident in every glance that flickered his way. Each subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. No one spoke of it aloud. Yet the residue of suspicion lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Amelia White re-emerged after some time, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Her smile returned, effortless as ever, as though the earlier confrontation had been nothing more than a brief interruption to her otherwise seamless performance. She moved gracefully between the rows, pouring drinks, laughing lightly at polite jokes. But when she reached Marcus's row, the smile tightened, barely holding. "Would you care for some champagne, sir?" Her voice was silk over steel. Marcus met her gaze, holding it just long enough for discomfort to creep in. There was no malice in his eyes, just quiet observation. She wasn't used to being looked at so directly, especially by men like him. "No, thank you," he replied evenly, returning his attention to the screen embedded in the seat before him. Amelia lingered for a breath longer than necessary, as if waiting for something. An apology, perhaps, some concession that would smooth the edges of her embarrassment. Marcus offered none. She moved on. It was the same everywhere: stores, airports, restaurants. The stage changed, but the performance rarely did. There was always a moment when Marcus became something else in their eyes, no longer just a man in a suit. No longer a CEO returning from a conference. Just a suspicion wrapped in skin. The cabin grew quiet as the lights dimmed. Passengers began to recline their seats, pulling blankets over themselves as the plane drifted further from the continent they had left behind. Marcus closed his laptop and leaned back, letting his gaze drift across the cabin. His eyes caught the older gentleman across the aisle, the same one who had looked away earlier. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low, conspiratorial. Marcus glanced over. "I saw the whole thing." The man continued. "That was unnecessary." Marcus smiled faintly, his expression polite but distant. "I appreciate that." The man hesitated, sensing the wall between them. He shifted in his seat. "She's usually good," the man added, as if offering an olive branch on her behalf. Maybe she was having a bad day. Marcus's eyes lingered on him for a long moment. There it was again, that soft, well-meaning dismissal. A bad day. As if prejudice were just a passing mood. Something that could be explained away with a few tired words. "Maybe," Marcus said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "I imagine I've run into a lot of people having bad days over the years." The man opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he nodded, his gaze falling to his lap. Marcus turned away, letting the conversation slip into silence. He closed his eyes, but rest did not come easily. Even at 30,000 feet, even wrapped in the luxury of first class, there were boundaries he could not cross, spaces he could not fully occupy. It was not about the fork. It was about the quiet, unspoken question that followed him everywhere he went. "Do you belong here?" Marcus Bell didn't sleep. The cabin lights dimmed, casting long shadows over the faces of sleeping passengers. But Marcus remained upright, his eyes fixed on the soft glow of the horizon stretching beyond the small oval window. The sky at 30,000 feet carried a particular kind of quiet, one that could fool a man into thinking he was alone, above the world and its noise. But Marcus knew better. There was no escaping certain things, not even in the rarefied air of first class. Prejudice was quieter here, more refined in its delivery, but no less potent. It arrived wrapped in smiles, delivered by the hands of people who believed themselves untouched by it. Amelia White passed by his row again, this time without lingering. Still, Marcus could feel the ripple of her presence, the faint tremor in her posture as she avoided his gaze. He wondered if she thought about what had happened, or if, by morning, the incident would dissolve into memory, reduced to nothing more than a wrinkle in her otherwise polished day. Marcus shifted in his seat, stretching his legs beneath the blanket. His foot brushed against something soft, small. He glanced down. It was a child's shoe. He scanned the cabin, his eyes settling on a young girl curled up 2 rows ahead. Her mother slept beside her, head resting awkwardly against the window. The child must have kicked it off in her sleep, unaware that it had wandered. Marcus knelt, carefully retrieving the shoe. As he did, another presence entered the aisle, Amelia, standing just behind him. Their eyes met. "I believe this belongs to her," Marcus said quietly, holding the shoe between them. For a moment, Amelia hesitated. It was brief, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Then, she stepped forward and accepted the shoe with a nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than before. Marcus watched her return the shoe to the sleeping child, kneeling with a tenderness that felt at odds with the coldness she had shown him earlier. It was a strange thing, Marcus thought, how easily people divided themselves, compartmentalized their empathy. The same hands that had reached for his belongings without permission now tucked the shoe beneath a child's blanket with care. The inconsistency wasn't lost on him. As Amelia rose, she glanced Marcus's way again. This time, she didn't look through him. There was something else, a flicker of recognition. Perhaps, though not apology. Marcus wasn't sure if it mattered. He returned to his seat, leaning back as the engines hummed beneath his feet. Across the aisle, the older man who had spoken earlier watched the interaction unfold, offering Marcus a small, almost embarrassed smile when their eyes met. Marcus didn't return it. In his experience, these moments were rarely about personal malice. It was far simpler than that. People like Amelia and the older man across the aisle often lived in a world that allowed them to believe prejudice was an event, something that happened with volume and violence. Something distant. But Marcus knew the truth. It was not about grand gestures or hateful words. It was in the space between the missing fork and the lingering glance. Between the champagne offer and the child's shoe. And it was in that space, small and quiet, where the real damage was done. The sky outside the window bled into soft hues of purple and gold. The distant sun pulling at the edges of dawn. The plane pressed forward, steady and indifferent to the silent currents flowing beneath the cabin's polite exterior. Marcus Bell remained awake, his eyes drifting across the aisle to where Amelia White now stood, folding napkins with mechanical precision. Her movements were smooth, but Marcus could see the tension in her hands, the way her fingers gripped the cloth too tightly, the way her jaw tensed with each pass of the fold. She felt it too, the residue of what had passed between them. Marcus wondered how many others on this flight had noticed. Not the fork, not the surface of it, but the weight beneath, the slow, invisible shifting of power in the room, the unspoken calculation that had taken place in every gaze turned toward him. There were no raised voices, no confrontation anyone could name. And yet, Marcus felt as if he had been on trial. The trial had ended in silence, as such trials often did. The evidence, one fork, retrieved from the floor, had been presented, and the case quietly dismissed. But Marcus knew the verdict had been rendered long before the fork ever disappeared. He watched Amelia now, wondering if she thought of him as he thought of her. Perhaps not. Perhaps for her, he was already fading, a shadow she would forget by the time the wheels touched down in London. But Marcus would carry this moment with him, as he had carried others like it. It was always the same story, told in different rooms. Across the aisle, the older man stirred, pretending to read the in-flight magazine but stealing glances at Marcus from behind its pages. Marcus let him look. "Can I ask you something?" the man said finally, lowering the magazine just enough to make eye contact. His voice was low, conspiratorial, as if whatever he intended to say wasn't meant for the rest of the cabin. Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I've been flying this route for years," the man continued. "I know Amelia. She's not usually like that." Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "Like what?" The man hesitated, unsure how much ground he was willing to tread. "I mean, you know. She was probably just having a bad day." Marcus finished for him. His tone wasn't harsh, but there was no warmth in it either. The man's mouth opened slightly, but no words followed. Marcus leaned forward, folding his hands neatly over his lap. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice low but firm. "How many bad days does a man have to explain away before he begins to wonder if the days aren't the problem?" The man shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under Marcus's gaze. "I don't mean anything by it," the man muttered, but his eyes betrayed him. He meant something. He just didn't have the words to say it. Marcus nodded, leaning back once more. "I know." That was the weight of politeness, the burden of making others feel comfortable in the discomfort they had created. It was exhausting, this endless smoothing over of cracks that weren't his to mend. Amelia returned to the front of the cabin, her eyes briefly catching Marcus's once more. This time, Marcus looked away first. He wasn't angry. Anger required too much energy. What Marcus felt was something quieter, older, something that had long since settled into his bones. The world had taught him long ago that dignity was not freely given. It was something he had to hold on to tightly, because others would try to strip it from him in 1,000 subtle ways. Sometimes, all it took was a missing fork. The cabin fell silent again, save for the soft murmur of engines and the occasional rustling of blankets. But Marcus could still feel the trial in the air, lingering like the aftertaste of something bitter. He wasn't sure if Amelia had learned anything from it, but Marcus had learned long ago that these moments were not for them. They were for him to remind him of the world as it was, and to steel him for the next trial, the next accusation, the next fork. The plane sailed through the thinning dark, the first hints of morning unraveling across the sky. The hum of the engines pressed gently against the silence. But Marcus Bell felt no ease in the quiet. He knew better than to expect comfort. Marcus watched the world shift beyond the window clouds thinning, the Atlantic sprawling endlessly beneath him. But inside the cabin, the air remained taut, stretched by the weight of something unspoken, something that had not been fully resolved. It was always like this. Long after the confrontation ended, after the fork was found and hands were washed clean of blame, the tension lingered, not in words, but in glances, in the careful way Amelia White avoided his row, in the way the older man across the aisle sat stiffly, pretending to read but saying nothing more. Politeness had been restored, but only as a fragile mask stretched over the deeper fracture that no one dared name. Marcus shifted slightly, catching Amelia's reflection in the glass. She was speaking quietly with another flight attendant near the galley, her voice low and measured. Marcus could not hear the words, but he recognized the posture, the subtle dip of her head, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward him as if unsure whether to glance or avoid altogether. She was explaining herself. Marcus had seen it before, the hurried justification, the attempt to smooth over the rough edges of conscience. She wasn't apologizing, not directly. This was the explanation she gave to herself, the one she would repeat when she thought back to this flight. He could almost hear it. It wasn't about race. It never was. Not out loud, but Marcus understood the lie, because he had lived with it longer than she had. It wasn't the accusation that lingered, but the small humiliations that followed, the fragile attempts at recovery, the way people like Amelia carried on as if nothing had happened, as if Marcus's silence somehow equaled forgiveness. Forgiveness wasn't the point. Marcus felt the weight of it now, heavy as the ocean beneath the plane. The quiet was interrupted by movement. Amelia approached again, carrying a tray of coffee and breakfast pastries. Her expression was unreadable, carefully practiced into something neutral. "Good morning," she said, her voice light, as if they were strangers meeting for the first time. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Bell?" Marcus regarded her for a long moment, letting the question hang between them. He considered refusing, letting the moment stretch until the silence became too heavy for her to bear. But something stopped him. Marcus had no interest in punishing Amelia. The truth was, he had met too many people like her to hold on to any personal resentment. She was simply part of the machinery, another cog in a system that had been humming long before either of them had stepped foot on this plane. "I would," Marcus said finally, his tone even but distant. Amelia nodded, pouring the coffee with steady hands, careful not to spill a drop. As she placed the cup on his tray table, her eyes flickered toward him, just briefly. "Mr. Bell," she hesitated, the words hanging awkwardly. "I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. It wasn't much." The apology arrived late, carefully pruned and stripped of any direct admission of fault. Marcus gave a small nod, but he did not say thank you. Instead, he simply lifted the cup, taking a sip as Amelia moved down the aisle, her steps light but quick, as if relieved to have dispensed with the matter. Marcus tasted the bitterness of the coffee, but it was not nearly as bitter as the taste left by the morning's events. It was never about the fork. It was about the space he occupied, the way his presence demanded an explanation that others were not required to give. Marcus settled into his seat, the warmth of the coffee lingering against his palms. He glanced out the window again. watching as the first hints of London flickered somewhere on the horizon. He wondered how long Amelia's apology would stay with her. For Marcus, it would last far longer. The coffee cup trembled slightly as the plane shifted through a pocket of turbulence. Marcus Bell steadied it with one hand, though his gaze remained fixed beyond the window, where the horizon now glowed faintly with the soft ember of morning. The apology, though spoken, had not truly settled. It hung in the air, weightless and thin, dissipating like vapor. Marcus knew better than to hold onto it. Words meant little when they were crafted more for the comfort of the speaker than the receiver. Across the aisle, the older man, the one who had tried to defend Amelia's behavior, fidgeted with his watch, sneaking glances in Marcus's direction as if debating whether to reopen the conversation. Marcus could feel the question lingering just behind the man's lips, waiting for the right moment to cross the divide between them. Marcus had lived long enough to recognize the signs. It wasn't curiosity, it was guilt, wearing the familiar face of awkward small talk. And guilt, Marcus knew, had a way of demanding answers from the wrong people. The man cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Bell." Marcus turned his head slightly but didn't speak. He let the silence respond first, letting the man feel the weight of stepping into this space. "I was thinking about what you said earlier," the man continued, his voice low as if the other passengers might overhear. "About people having bad days." Marcus raised an eyebrow but offered no encouragement. "I suppose it's easy for some of us to miss things like that," the man added, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Marcus let the statement sit between them for a moment. "Miss things like what?" Marcus asked finally, setting the cup gently onto the tray table. The man hesitated, searching for the right words. "I mean, misunderstandings. Moments like what happened with Amelia." Marcus's eyes narrowed, though his face betrayed nothing. "That wasn't a misunderstanding," Marcus replied, his voice quiet but pointed. "It was an assumption." The man exhaled sharply, as if caught off guard by the precision of the response. Marcus leaned slightly forward, resting his arms on the edge of his seat. "You saw the way she looked at me. The way she handled it," Marcus continued, his tone calm but unflinching. "That wasn't confusion. It was certainty that I must have done something wrong." The older man looked down at his lap, nodding slowly, though Marcus wasn't sure if he truly understood or if he simply wished to end the conversation. Marcus pressed on. "You can dress it up in polite language. Call it misunderstanding, call it protocol, but we both know what it was." The man opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus cut him off gently. "And the truth is, it happens all the time. The faces change, but the story doesn't." The cabin around them remained quiet, but Marcus could feel the pulse of the conversation growing heavier, like a current drawing them both deeper. "You see," Marcus continued, his gaze steady, "people like Amelia, they think they're being careful. They think they're just following the rules. But those rules are different when they look at someone like me. The boundaries shift, and suddenly, I have to explain my existence in spaces I've already earned." The man nodded again, more slowly this time. "I suppose I never thought about it like that," the man admitted. Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. "Most people don't," he replied, "because they don't have to." The man looked as if he wanted to say something more, but the moment passed. He leaned back into his seat, retreating into the comfort of silence. Marcus did not resent him. The man would return to his life after the plane landed, carrying with him a fleeting awareness, one that might fade by the time his feet touched the ground. But Marcus would carry this conversation, just as he carried all the others. Because memory, for men like Marcus, was not something that faded. It persisted, following them into boardrooms, hotel lobbies, and first-class cabins. It whispered to them in moments of stillness, reminding them of the delicate balance they walked each day, the tightrope stretched between dignity and survival. And even now, as the plane drifted closer to London, Marcus knew the next fork would not be far behind. As the plane began its descent, the world below slowly emerged from shadow patches of green and gray stretching across the English countryside. Rivers winding like veins through the morning mist. The seatbelt sign blinked to life with a soft chime, and passengers stirred awake, adjusting their seats and gathering belongings as the cabin filled with quiet murmurs. Marcus Bell sat still, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He felt the familiar weight returning, the quiet gravity of stepping back into a world that had not changed overnight. The ground may have shifted beneath the plane, But the ground waiting for him in London was much the same as the one he had left in New York. Across the aisle, the older man folded his newspaper, sneaking one last glance toward Marcus. Marcus felt it but didn't turn his head. He had no more words to offer. He knew the type of man sitting across from him. A man shaped by politeness, by the belief that decency alone could smooth over the cracks in the world. Marcus had met many men like him, some well-meaning, others indifferent, but they all carried the same luxury, the ability to step in and out of the conversation whenever they pleased. For Marcus, the conversation never ended. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, tires skimming the tarmac, and a collective exhale spread through the cabin. Marcus powered down his laptop, folding it neatly into his briefcase. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Amelia White appeared again, moving down the aisle with practiced efficiency, thanking each passenger as if the morning's events had been gently erased from memory. When she reached Marcus's row, she hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Bell," she said, her voice even but carefully measured. Marcus met her eyes for the first time since her apology. There was something there, uncertainty, maybe even regret, but not enough to shift the balance between them. He nodded once, offering no smile, no reassurance. He could feel her discomfort, the quiet tension that stretched between them like glass that might crack beneath too much weight. But Marcus did not break the silence for her sake. As Amelia continued down the aisle, Marcus rose to retrieve his bag from the overhead compartment. The older man across the aisle followed suit, fumbling slightly with his luggage. "You know," the man said suddenly, his voice low, "I think people like her, they don't mean any harm." Marcus paused, his hand tightening briefly around the handle of his briefcase. He turned, his expression calm but unyielding. "Meaning no harm doesn't erase the harm done," Marcus replied. The older man shifted awkwardly, offering a tight smile that faded almost as quickly as it arrived. Marcus stepped into the aisle, moving forward without looking back. The truth was simple. Amelia White would forget him long before he forgot her. And that was how the world worked, how it had always worked. For Marcus, every glance, every accusation, every slight misunderstanding gathered and settled beneath his skin. He carried them through airport terminals, into boardrooms, and across city streets. They became part of him, not because he wished to hold on to them, but because the world ensured he could not set them down. As he stepped off the plane and into the crowded terminal, Marcus Bell walked with quiet dignity, each step a reminder that, even in the most fleeting moments, he was required to bear the weight of things unseen by others. The fork was gone, but the story, the quiet trial at 30,000 feet remained. And Marcus knew it always would.